Speak up. As you can tell, we will be recording this session, and that will be made available later on this afternoon. To start off with, Alabama. Do we have a rep from Alabama? California? Colorado?
Colorado's here.
Thank you. Connecticut?
Connecticut's here.
Thank you. Delaware?
They can hear you and you can hear us right now.
How do we?
Ohio here.
Delaware?
I hit star. Whatever it is.
Hawaii?
Oh yeah, what did they say? I'm sorry, what's that part?
Idaho?
They're taking a walk.
Oh, okay, sorry.
If you are in a room full of people, we would welcome if you could press your mute button or press *6 to place your line on mute. If you need to untoggle to unmute, again, you can press *6. I will repeat that last state. Idaho, Idaho, Iowa.
Iowa's here.
Thank you. Kansas, Kentucky, Maine, Michigan.
Michigan's here.
Thank you. Missouri,
Missouri is here.
Montana, Nevada.
Nevada's here.
Thank you. New Hampshire.
Patricia?
North Carolina.
North Carolina's here.
Thank you. North Dakota. Ohio.
Ohio is here.
Thank you. Oregon.
Oregon is here.
Thank you. Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania's here.
Thank you. South Carolina.
South Carolina is here.
Thank you. South Dakota.
South Dakota's here.
Thank you. Utah.
Utah's on.
Thank you. Vermont.
Vermont is here.
Thank you. Washington State.
Washington's here.
Thank you. West Virginia.
West Virginia is here.
Thank you. Wisconsin. Wisconsin. And Wyoming is the last state on the list.
Bump in and say hi.
Want me to go through again?
Colorado is here.
Thank you. I will go through the names of those that were not present, and I'll start with Alabama, California.
California is here.
Thank you. Delaware.
Delaware's here.
Thank you, sir. Idaho. Idaho. Kansas.
Kansas is here.
Thank you. Kentucky. Maine.
Maine is here.
Thank you. Montana. New Hampshire. North Dakota.
North Dakota's here.
Thank you, sir. Wisconsin. And Wyoming. And now I will call roll for work groups. If either of the co-chairs or a member is on, if you could just please say present. I will start alphabetically. Accessibility and accommodations. Deborah Michael on. Next one, item development. Kevin Ervigi.
Item development's on.
Thanks, sir. Performance tasks. Shelby and
Performance
Nikki.
test. Yes, Nikki's on.
Thank you, Nikki. Test administration.
Present.
Thank you. Test design.
Vince and Jane are here.
Thank you. Formative processes and tools.
Here.
Thank you. Reporting. Mark or Steve. Reporting. Next one is research or evaluation or psychometric validation.
Mohammed is here.
Thank you,
And
sir.
Steve is here.
Thank
Is
you.
here too.
Technology approach. John or Steve.
Yes, we are. One of us is here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Transitions to the Common Core.
We're here.
Laura or thank you.
Thank you very much. We've, as you can tell, we do have quite a few folks on the phone, so this is really exciting. And I want to hand it over to Joe Wilhoff to start us off with introductions and welcomes. Joe, are you on the line?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Thank you, Kristen. So first of all, let's remind everybody that we do have so many folks on the phone that it's a good idea to be on mute so that you know the background noise gets as muffled as possible. I do want to welcome everybody. This is a glorious day for the consortium and very exciting. This webinar kicks off our release of the first round of the content specifications with the content mapping for English language arts literacy. The document is ready to roll, and we will be releasing it early tomorrow to folks within the consortium. And this webinar represents an orientation to the work ahead and to that document. And so I would encourage folks to keep their eyes open on their emails for the document to come through. In particular, I do want to give heartfelt thanks to Linda Darling-Hammond and to Karen Hess, who both did an awful lot of heavy lifting to get us to where we are today. And Karen, with regard to coordinating all the content experts and managing the version control of the document. Linda for providing key assistance to myself and to Karen, and also for shepherding the assistance of Mark and Jamal Abedi in particular with regard to accessibility issues. So thanks to all of them, and also, of course, to the project management partner, WestEd, for the coordination of all the various logistics and putting things together. The last thing that you'll be doing is responding to a survey with regard to providing feedback on this, and we are going to be welcoming feedback, and that appears later in the webinar. But Tony Alpert did a lot of work with regard to the development of our survey. So with that as welcomes and as thank yous, I think without further ado, we'll go forward. Christian, unless there's anything else you needed me to say.
No, I believe we can march into maybe describing the agenda for today. I'm happy to do that, unless you'd like to just, we've got the agenda displayed so folks have a kind of a preview of what's in store for the webinar.
Go right ahead, Christian.
Okay. I believe we have it displayed. As you can see, we've obviously, we've done a good job. We tackled the first one, which is the welcome. We'll be moving into the next topic, which is the evidence-based design overview. As folks know, the intent of this webinar is to really kind of roll out these ELA content specifications, but prior to rolling them out, we also wanted to have the opportunity to kind of set the stage, if you will, from an evidence-based design perspective. So that's what we'll be covering in those first 40 minutes of the agenda. And then following that, we'll have some questions and answers regarding that presentation and, of course, evidence-based design. Then we'll move into the content specifications proper.
I don't know.
Really,
Did he say that?
Broken up. I wonder if you could mute your phone. I'm hearing some background. Then after the questions and answers, we move into the content specifications review with an initial tie between what was the presentation for the evidence-based design and the content specifications that will be presented by Linda Darling-Hammond. Then moving into a walkthrough of the content specs themselves, the process for developing the content specifications, the different components of the content specifications. Today's webinar will then culminate with really the description of the review process, the kind of feedback we're looking for, description of the timelines and activities of that feedback, and then of course we save some time for questions and answers. I rolled through it pretty quickly, but that gives you a lay of the land for today's webinar. Any additions, Joe, Tony, any folks on the phone? Okay, without further ado, we'll move to this first, or I should say second agenda topic, which is evidence-based design overview, and then I'll turn it over to Joe Ryan.
Christian, thank you very much. This is Joe Ryan in Phoenix, Arizona. Glad to be joining you today. My task today is to provide an overview of evidence-based design, and in doing this, I'm going to reference a number of topics and then move on. So I would urge you to keep track of the fact that this is an overview, and I'm trying to hit the major points, the big topics. Let me show you the 5 major topics that I'll be discussing today. I want to start by saying a little bit about curriculum instruction and assessment. Even though we are focusing on assessment in evidence-based design, I want to put this in the broader context. We are, after all, educators, and this triad of curriculum instruction and assessment is the big picture. Our purpose is to help every student learn up to the level of standards that we have in mind. Second topic, and it's really the central issue in assessment, is validity. And you notice I'm going to talk about the past and the present. I want to highlight some earlier ways validity was conceptualized, in major part to show you how we're thinking about it today and how evidence-based design is almost obligatory if you're going to try to create validity in the work we do in SBAC. So there is clearly a need to talk about validity. I'm going to then show you a quick picture of the basic model for evidence-based design. I'm going to return later to it, but I want to give you sort of an advanced organizer of what the real focus topic is, the basic model. We've moved ahead. Let me see here. I'm going to talk to you about some traditional approaches and then evidence-based design. We've moved on to the next slide. So let me talk about curriculum instruction and assessment. In this model, variations of which I know you've seen. Hello?
This is Joe Wilhoff interjecting. Somebody's phone is playing like marching band music, and so I wonder if they can go on mute. It's a little distracting. That may be like your agency background music or something like that. So if you could use the *6 or #6, which mutes you from the webinar and is not your internal muting, that would be appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. That saves me marching around.
Yeah.
Helpful. Get my workout. This is a picture you've seen in some form or another. A couple of things I want to call your attention to. First of all, it is student-centered. We're in the student learns business. Although our contribution is substantially from the assessment side, certainly mine is, we're in the business of helping students learn. Now, I have students in the center, but I don't modify students. In fact, what we're mostly interested in is students' learning processes. How do students learn things? How do they acquire skills? How do they go from being novices to experts? Understanding those features of students' learning informs the curriculum and, of course, informs us what we need to teach and what we need to do. The issue here is, even though I have students labeled in a generic sense, we're really focusing on students' learning and their progression from novice to expert. The curriculum, of course, is all those activities and materials we arrange to have students engage in. Instruction, I generally like to think of very broadly as the experience we arrange for students to have. I want to, even though this looks like instruction is something done to students, instruction is actually the experience.
The leader has muted your line. To unmute your line, press #6.
Am I back on?
You're back on. Sorry about that,
Sorry,
Joe. We were trying to control the marching band music, and I think we may have done it. We'll see.
We'll okay. Could somebody tell me where I got muted? Do you know where I was?
We were still on this slide here, and I believe I couldn't tell.
Okay, I'll finish this one up and move on, because this is really by way of presenting the big picture. The two major takeaways here is, first of all, we're interested in students and their learning. How do they go from being novices to proficient or really expert in writing and reading? So we need to understand that, and that's a major focus and underpinning of evidence-based design. Assessment, of course, is what we're focused on today in particular, and assessment is a lot broader than has been traditionally conceptualized. In the matter of assessment, the criterion, beyond all, is validity. So let's take a look at the validity material in the next slide. Can we move to the next slide? There we go. Okay, and as I said, I'm going to talk about a past and present. In the past, there are three features I want to emphasize and one I'll sort of add on to. The first is validity, as it has been historically described, has been seen as an attribute of a test. We generally have talked about the validity of a test, validating a test, validating an assessment. What we're going to see momentarily is that started to change dramatically in the late 50s, 60s, and of course up through now. Secondly, traditionally, validity was talked about as there being three kinds of validity. One is the degree to which a test measures what is designed content validity. There was also a very operational approach. That is, if you constructed an assessment of reading, one of the validation issues was, does it correlate with other measures of reading? Always the issue, of course, are the criterion measures valid? Now, along the way, of course, construct validity was added, and that is, in fact, more like the way we're thinking of validity. The take-home here that I think is critically important is validity has historically been seen as an attribute of the test. So let's look at how we take a look at validity now in the next slide. This is the definition from the standards from the American Ed Research Association, American Psych Association, National Council on Measurement Ed. The most important issue is validity refers to the degree to which empirical evidence and theory support the interpretation of test scores entailed by the proposed uses of the test. Two important things I want to emphasize here. There's evidence and theory. The other more general issue is it's about the interpretations of the test scores. So in my little summary of 3 points just below this, in our current thinking, validity is an attribute of the interpretation of the test. It is not an attribute of the test itself. So when we draw conclusions, make inferences, we have students perform some activity, we infer an underlying ability or some cognitive process. The interesting question is, the validity question is, what evidence do we have to substantiate that interpretation? Second point, validity is evidence-based. We can't just claim validity. We have to have evidence that it's true. The third point is that we can use theory as a way to substantiate validity of our interpretations. So if we have a model or a theory of how students develop certain skills, problem solving, writing, and so on, we can look to see from our observations, do we see things in the work of students, in their performance, their activities, that are consistent with the theory. So if we have empirical evidence that corresponds to our theoretical models, model of cognition, for example, that's how we build the validity argument. And it is not about the test, it's about how we interpret the test. Given that view of validity, of course, we have to focus on interpretation, evidence, which is why we have these models today, evidence-based design. Let's take a look at the basic structure of the evidence-based design framework. There are three major parts to this. It's called the assessment triangle. The base of this triangle, what it stands on, what really supports it is cognition. And let me elaborate on that just a little bit. What we mean by cognition is what's going on in students' heads when students are reading, when they're composing a manuscript, when they're editing work, what's happening, what processes are occurring. Now, we can't really see inside students' heads. Actually, for the Star Trek fans, if we got Mr. Spock, we could do a Vulcan mind meld and see what's going on. But since we can't do that generally, if you look in the upper left, we have to make some observations of students. We have to have them say something, do something, create something that we can observe, on the basis of which we can make interpretations about what actually is going on in their cognitive processes. What knowledge base do they seem to have? How have they stored that knowledge? How are they retrieving it? How are they manipulating it? That's how we operate in this view of assessment. What I find most valuable in this conceptualization is moving away from looking at the methods of observations, moving away from how good are the items. Now, I think we have to have good items, but the first thing we have to have is elaborated models of what students are thinking, how they're reasoning, their cognitive processes. And let me mention, to look a little bit ahead, cognition in the traditional view was often separated from content. We thought about learning in content. We thought about learning in the abstract, and I'll be showing you some examples of that very shortly. Cognition in evidence-based design work is cognition in a context, cognition in writing, cognition, the cognitive processes involved in reading. And they may be very different from the cognitive processes that students are using in science or mathematics. So I'm going to come back to all of this again, but I wanted to give you kind of an advanced view. The evidence-based design framework is most importantly based on an understanding of how students learn, how they go from on a progression from novice to expert, and it's in the context of a content domain. Let's take a look then at what I would call an early model of cognition, and I think this might be familiar to some of you. I don't know if I can ask how many of you recognize this. I'm thinking a lot of educators would recognize Bloom et al. From 1956. We generally don't think of this as a model of cognition, but let me point out in 1956, a very common understanding of how students progress, how we learn to do things, was a behavioristic model. That basically we heard combinations of words, or we saw them in text, we saw certain structures of sentences over and over, and when we functioned with them effectively, we were reinforced. So a dominant force up through certainly the 50s was one variation or another of behaviorism. this is a substantial departure from that view. This is saying there are different kinds of things that students are doing as they attempt tasks. Knowledge, of course, recall and recognition. Application is a cognitive process. You retrieve some strategies or information, you apply it to a novel task. Analysis and synthesis, of course, are higher order, in a sense, higher order thinking. What I want to point out is there are precursors to our understanding of cognitive processes. Also going on in the 50s, of course, was some of Piaget's earlier work, the growth of logic from childhood to adolescence. If you think of growth of logic from childhood to adolescence, that's a progression. And in that work is the suggestion that different things are going on as students go from childhood to adolescence. Now, a major reason I'm using this model will, in fact, be to point out its shortcomings. And I'm just using this particular model with all due respect to Lauren Anderson, who has revised it, and other very useful models. There are some limitations. So let's look at the next slide. Shortcomings of generic taxonomies. So if we have a taxonomy of cognition of some sort, whether it's Bloom's or Anderson et al. Or Webb or whatever, these are generic taxonomies, and one of the problems is that generally they're applied at a point in time. They don't look at a developmental process or a learning progression. In a sense, it's one lens, and we're applying that lens of cognition. How students learn, when they learn, might change, but if you have this, say, the 6 steps in the Bloom taxonomy, you don't necessarily recognize the progression and qualitative types of learning. Second issue is it's actually a model of what students are doing in response to assessment tasks. So we create tasks, which we think evoke application. So we're learning about what students do in response to assessment tasks, but we're not learning necessarily what students are doing cognitively as they learn to become expert in a content area. Now, if, as we will be doing, of course, in Smarter Balance, you create tasks, we create tasks that reflect development across learning progressions. We create tasks that give us insight into students learning in a context. Then, while we are still focusing on what students are doing in response to a task, that task is connected to a cognitive process in which we have some substantial interest. Much of what you'll be reviewing in the document is a description of what's going on in writing, for example. The third issue I want to mention about generic taxonomies is generally they separate cognition from context or learning domains. I've seen numerous examples of a variety of taxonomies superimposed on social sciences, superimposed on writing. Generic taxonomies of the very same one apply to science and math and so on. It's a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, and it doesn't take into consideration that what students are doing, what we all do in different content domains, might vary by content domain. And that is a serious limitation of the generic models that are picked up and applied to all kinds of content domains. Let's take a look at a slight improvement on that first slide, that first picture of the taxonomy. The next step, and it's also kind of a step in the history of assessment development. Now you see in this approach, this is a model now that still has cognitive processes, knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, but now we are connecting it to some content. I intentionally, by the way, picked a content area besides English language arts, so we would focus on the assessment structural issues and not the content. You'll be getting plenty of that in a little bit. This is a middle school unit on weather processes. So this does show some advancement in that we see processes applied in a content domain. Let me call your attention to the domain where the processes is reduced to 6 discrete content elements. I would suggest, of course I made this model up so I could make this suggestion, but I would suggest that's a pretty modest description of the content domain. And indeed, one of the terribly important, and in my view, one of the most valuable contributions of our approach in SBAC is we don't have cognition separated from content, and we focus very carefully, a very comprehensive description of the content domain. So this does, in fact, cross-process with content, but it leaves out the other element in the evidence-based design model, that is, how do we make observations? So let's take a look at the next slide, which includes here an observation model. The observation model in this example is multiple choice items. And what we observe is students sit down, they take multiple choice items, we observe their answers. If we're very clever, we write multiple choice items with some answers that are maybe not exactly correct, but for which we could give partial credit. But in any case, most observations with multiple choice items are right or wrong. So if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of this table, you see the number 40. That's how many items would be on this assessment model. We would get 40 discrete observations, which provide us samples of behavior in this content domain of where the processes. Now, there's a variety of ways to think about this, but no matter how you think about it, 40 glimpses into the domain where the processes does not give us a very adequate sampling of that content domain. Different of us on the phone today come from different regions of the country. I don't see, for example, in this content listing, dust storms. That would be a content topic here in the Southwest that people would be interested in. I suppose other folks are interested in snow. What I want to point out is in evidence-based design, we focus a lot of attention on getting an elaborated, comprehensive understanding of the content domain, and that is not separate from the cognitive process. There are much better models for observation for this unit on whether processes. As time allows and your interests suggest, I'll be happy to chat about that in the Q&A period. Let's take a look at how data from this type of approach is interpreted. In the traditional approach, we tend to look at test scores. So when we say, how do students do, or what do they know in the content domain, we say 35. Well, that's not really an interpretation. That's like literal description. We can also report scores by content strand, going across those topics like wind, or we can come down the cognitive process application. But both for the content strand and the cognitive process, we have very, very limited observations on the basis of which to make any inference. And all we have observed is whether a student has answered an item correctly or not. Now, another approach might be to compare scores at 2 points in time. That will tell us something about they're getting more points, but whether that corresponds to actually progressing along in some increasingly effective cognitive processes, this is not clear, because it's really asking the same question, same specifications, same cognitive model, same content, and it's asking the same question over and over again. And while it may tell us how somebody's advancing in that framework, it isn't telling us how somebody's advancing across a continuum. And of course, in traditional approaches, we often rank order students and talk about percentile positions, which tells us absolutely nothing about the cognitive processes that students are operating with, are improving upon, and moving towards. Shortcomings, as I've mentioned, is in the traditional approach, we focus on scores, not really cognition. There's very limited evidence of complex cognitive processes. We are just picking out these tiny little pictures of discrete elements in what can be a very comprehensive and believe it or not, fascinating domain, weather processes. But we don't really see that with this particular model of observation. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, as a shortcoming, this approach gives us a fairly limited sampling of the content domain. You can, of course, elaborate on it. You can have a longer test, but sooner or later, the test length issue becomes one of practicality and endurance for students, and it's not particularly effective. Now, the reason I had pointed out these shortcomings to the traditional approach is, first of all, to illustrate that there are some precursors to what we're doing, but they have serious limitations. People understood that something was going on in students' heads. There were cognitive processes at play. They operated on content, but the cognitive processes were considered decontextualized from the content, and the sampling of content was quite limited and didn't really, in certainly certain of the observation models, take into account dynamic interactions or connections among elements in the content domain. Let's take a look then, returning to the evidence-based design framework. We saw this, of course, a few minutes ago. What I have pointed out here is traditionally we had methods of observations, but tended to be somewhat limited. We had methods of interpretation, norm reference scores, numbers of points right. We often applied statistical procedures, but they didn't tell us, they didn't provide very powerful insights into cognitive processes. And at the base in the traditional system were models of cognitive processes that were removed from the content by and large, were certainly not content specific, and there was a one-size-fits-all. I'm going to go through each of these three, but I want to mention that even though I'm talking about each of these three one at a time, let's take a look at the next slide. I want to remind you, I am going to describe them separately, but the big bang in this approach depends on their interconnectedness and synchrony. What's important is we have a theoretically well-grounded model of what students are doing mentally, what their cognitive processes are in the content domain. That's the base. That informs our understanding of how we can arrange methods of observations, how we can arrange to have students say something, do something, create something, which we can then interpret in terms not of how many points did they get in the observation model, but we can interpret in terms of what does it tell us must be going on in a student's head, such that we would see the results in our observation model. As I've mentioned several times, the value and the beauty of this approach is it starts focused on what we are most interested in, what's going on in students' reasoning, cognitive development in the context of a content domain. I'm going to talk through models for cognition with an aside here and there. What are models of cognition? Well, they're beliefs about how students acquire, store, represent, and retrieve information and develop competence in a particular area. To put it in our context, how do students represent knowledge and develop competence in a domain? How do they develop the skills for reading and get better at it? In our view, that is, in the evidence-based design view, these models for cognition should reflect the most recent and the most credible scientific evidence of typical learning processes, not just people's opinion about how people go from novice to expert, but what evidence do we have about those processes? And secondly, all of these models for cognition should be informed by the experiences of expert teachers. Now, while we're on the slide, and I'm going to do this a little later as well, you notice in the second bullet, I refer to typical learning processes. Pretty much all of my discussion and many of the discussions we'll be having are reflecting issues of typical learning, typical approaches. And I want to emphasize, not to keep in the back of your mind, but to keep in the front of your mind, not all students are typical. That while we are discussing these at a fairly general level in my presentation and subsequently, we have to remember that when we deal with student populations, there are students who progress differently. For example, one of the topics in which you have an interest, of course, is listening skills. You can't tell because you can't see me, and even if you could, you might not notice I have a hearing aid in. Well, if you were trying to measure my reading skills, listening skills, and I was a youngster in your class, you'd have to keep in mind that I might be different, that there are a lot of non-typical students in our classrooms, in our schools, and so while we are building broad models for the typical case, we have to be ever vigilant in reflecting, and what does this do for students who are not as typical as the mainstream? And there's a variety of ways in which students might not be typical, and we'll leave that for a different discussion in a work group, but it's not something to keep in the back of our minds, it's something to keep very clearly focused up front. Let's take a look at another aspect of the models of cognition in the approach we're using in evidence-based design. Our models for cognition are domain-based. They are contextualized. They are in situations like mathematics, science, reading, writing, and in the context of domain-based for students at certain developmental or learning points. They provide detailed descriptions of domain elements, their interrelationships, and the connection to cognitive processes. Later today, and in the documents you'll see, there's quite a bit of description of what's going on in these various domains to support claims that we hope we can make. And they're not in isolation. These elements interact with each other, and it's these interrelationships we also have to capture, and they are connected to the cognitive processes. They're not different from them. Cognitive processes are inherently embedded in a particular domain. The models for cognition we're interested in describe typical learning progressions towards competence, including milestones. Now, when I talk about learning progressions, imagine, just as a quick way to think about it, you have novice or beginning readers, and you have expert readers. What's in the roadway between novice and expert? What's the learning progression there? And along the way in that learning progression from novice to expert, are there some milestones? Are there some points at which we can say, this is now an important accomplishment that's going to lead to even increased skill development and cognitive development, and we might call those benchmarks. As we develop models for cognition, we have to recognize that our models can vary in detail or grain size, depending on the purpose of our assessment. At a general level, we might make broad claims because we have an intention of doing certain kinds of things with those results. We might make, I'm going to talk about this a little later, so I want to hold you in suspense for interpretation. But what's important to recognize is when we build models of cognition, they can vary in detail, in grain size, and it depends on what we want to use them for. The next step, cognition is at the base, the next is observation, a set of specifications for assessment tasks that will elicit illuminating responses from students. And I love the word illuminating. I can just see the lights going on and students are flashing up and down. And we need to think very broadly about these tasks. A fairly limited one, as I mentioned before, would be multiple choice items. What we're interested in general is creating tasks or situations that prompt students to say something, to do something, or create something. So it's an observable something, and it provides evidence to us to support our inferences, that's the interpretation part, about students' knowledge, skills, and cognitive processes. This is an important set of connected but somewhat different issues. That we're not interested in interpreting the performance on the task. What we're interested in is interpreting what the task evidence tells us about students' underlying knowledge, skills, and cognitive processes. Let's take a look at the next slide. The task must be explicitly linked to the cognitive model of learning. My heroes in the evolution of assessment, such as the state of the art is today, must be 25, 30 years ago, the National Council of Teachers of English said, no, we will not give multiple choice tests of writing. Basically, that group many decades ago said, if you want to know if students write, it has to be connected, the evidence, the observation must be connected to the student's actual writing, because something's going on in that process. There is a cognitive component underlying it. Again, as I mentioned, that task must provide evidence to support the targeted inferences and anticipated actions. So if you know you have a comprehensive model for writing or reading, you need to structure the tasks so that when students perform them, and it could be a speech, it could be writing, it could be a variety of activities, but that's the basis, not for saying how they did on that task, how they did on that essay, but it's the basis for making inferences about what they can do in general. What underlying competencies do the students have? And let's turn to interpretation. I have several things to say about that. So this is the upper right triangle in our evidence-based design model. These are methods and tools used to construct meaning from, make sense of, and reason with the assessment, observation, evidence. Now, I want to point out, the meaning is not in what we observe. We construct the meaning, any more than meaning is in the words. The interpretation of assessment information is constructed meaning. We try to make sense of, and we are working with what we've observed. There's a variety of tools that have been used for that over time. In the second bullet, you can see the methods for developing various interpretations do vary from formal statistical procedures, which has been the dominant response to improving interpretation in many fields, but it also can and should include informal judgmental processes or approaches. These are not informal in the sense of we just make them up. I'm contrasting that to the statistical approaches. So we might actually say informed judgmental approaches. These are not judgmental approaches made up on the spur of the moment informally. They are judgmental approaches, but they are well informed by experts in the field. The reliance on statistical procedures, I don't want people to stop doing that. That's in the field in which I work, and particularly for more recent approaches in what's called item response theory. That provides us a variety of ways to make inferences about underlying or latent skills, but in my judgment, we have not been willing to recognize the extraordinary value of informed judgmental approaches. Ironically, many of you have been involved, I suspect, in standard setting, So after all is said and done, in most large-scale assessment programs, the standards that define categories for achievement are in fact not statistical, although we overlay some statistical strategies, but those standards are in fact informed judgmental approaches. Next thing I want to mention about interpretations, notwithstanding the fact that we build observations specifically targeted to get insight into students' cognition, interpretations should utilize all available sources of information. The history of using one data source, one indicator, however good it might be, is not particularly advantageous in making valid inferences. So while we will collect information using certain assessment protocols, it's important to understand that any one approach does have some limitations. Now, I'm returning to a theme on the second bullet that I mentioned before, and I just want to get to it again. Interpretations are not made about the evidence from the observations. It's not about the evidence. It uses the evidence to make interpretations about learning and cognition. There's not very much to interpret about scores on an assessment. That's almost like a literal comprehension question. How well did Joey do on this essay that we have scored or whatever? The important thing to note is when we make interpretations in our model, we are simply using the evidence from the assessment. The evidence from the assessment is from the observations in the upper left corner of the triangle. Interpretation is in the upper right corner. The interpretation, however, is focused back to the cognitive processes, what's going on in students' minds. Let's take a look at the next slide on interpretation, and I hinted at this before. Interpretations can be constructed at varying levels of generality depending on the assessment purpose. We have broad generalizations or claims about an assessment system's learning outcome. These broader generalizations, or what we call claims, really talk about what's going on overall, what's the big picture. I'm going to talk more about claims and generalizations in a moment, but these are extremely valuable, and they are a very powerful antidote to the discrete reporting of teeny little elements of content. Second level of interpretation or generalizability, we might want to be making inferences about intermediate milestones or benchmarks in the learning process. Mentioned before in the progression from novitiate to expert, there are points along the way, and it might be our intention to structure observations to make interpretation about those benchmarks or milestones along the way. That might require different models for observations, not to the exclusion of others, but in addition to. And at another level, the third level, inferences about fine-grained steps or processes. That's what we might be interested in, and that is we might want to make inferences about very fine-grained steps or processes that reflect students' learning as they are learning. This would, of course, be a level of inference that teachers would be particularly interested in, so they could modify instruction on the fly. These three roughly could be considered summative, interim, or benchmark, and formative assessment processes. The nature of the inference we want to make will, in fact, change and add to the kinds of observational models we employ. The last thing I want to mention about interpretation in the last slide before I sum up is when we talk about claims, broad generalizations, they have certain attributes that are highly desirable. The first is that inferences or claims frame a manageable number of learning goals around which coherent and effective instruction can be organized. I want to contrast this in general to fairly lengthy list of state objectives that we see sometimes in the Common Core standards. It's a fairly elaborated list of important learning outcomes. When we talk about making broad generalizations, we have sort of built those up from the bottom to a broader general type of claim. Its value in instruction is extraordinary. I use the phrase manageable number of learning goals on purpose. If you can capture the essential learning outcomes reflective of well-documented cognitive processes, if you can capture those in a reasonable number of claims, then in fact the instructional forces have something to work with. They can get their heads around. It's manageable. These lengthy list of outcomes are very, very challenging, of course. Now, broader statements, of course, require elaborations. Since we are building up from the bottom and sort of rolling up from details to broader generalizations, we need to elaborate on what's included in this claim and why the claim is important. This is part of the claim, understanding the components and why all of this is terribly important. Again, if you go back to that very first model of curriculum, instruction, and assessment, claims with these attributes speak to the instructional force, the teaching community, much, much more effectively than these long lists of state objectives that we sometimes see. Claims or generalizations guide the specification of appropriate evidence. If we know what claim we want to make and support, what evidence do we have to accumulate to support, or if you will, validate the inference that students can do these things? And these claims guide our specification of appropriate evidence. What would we have to collect to have evidence in support of the claim? And lastly, when we have a coherent, well-organized claim, where we have elaborated on what's in the claim, what does it include, what's the full details that we have rolled up into the claim. When we've done that, it gives us a basis for talking about what it means. So the whole process of reporting to different interested audiences is informed by not just making the claim, but those second two attributes, elaborating on what's in it and explaining why they're important. That becomes a very important basis, a critical basis that I think supports instruction and also provides a way to talk to a variety of audiences. And this would be policy groups, both in education and the broader political realm, and of course parents. Let me sum up then. I actually have a stopwatch going and I need to stop shortly. Let me sum up three major things that I think evidence-based design does for us that earlier approaches didn't. First and foremost, it focuses on the essentials, learning in context. It focuses on the absolute necessity to be clear, sometimes painfully clear, sometimes you have to work through it, but the first step is building cognitive models of what students are doing cognitively as they are learning, what's required, how do they get information, what do they do with it, and it's in the context of a content domain. Secondly, having done that carefully, it guides our choice and it guides our development of methods of observation. And this is a very different approach. Often people run around with their favorite observational technique. Oh, I just love essays. Well, sometimes essay may not be what you want. I love multiple choice. It may not be the best way to get evidence in support of the inference that we want. And lastly, when we talk about how students are doing, that is, we report our results. In this process, we can report our results not in the language of the evidence we've collected, how many points get made, what norm, reference, percentile they're in, but it provides a mechanism for reporting in the substantive context and cognitive processes of a particular content area. Well, my stopwatch says I need to stop, so let me turn this back to Christian or whomever is going to handle the Q&A period.
Thanks, Joe. For the Q&A period, we are going to need to unmute the phones. As folks know, we had to actually mute all the lines
The leader has unmuted your line.
Great. So for folks that are not speaking, we do ask you to mute your line. So we'll just pause while people do that, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Obviously, you need to have your phone unmuted to ask a question. Okay, with that, are there questions regarding the presentation for Joe? We'll open it up to Q&A at this point.
Christian, I don't know if I put people to sleep or answered all the questions.
I might even extend, are there comments folks have? I think that might generate even some more questions if we open it up to comments and questions.
Joe and Christian, can you hear me? This is Joe Wilhoft.
We can hear you fine.
Great. So first of all, Joe, thanks an awful lot, and my apologies for not properly introducing you at the beginning, although I think
we either lost you, Joe, or you might be on mute.
Am I back?
You're back.
Okay. Joe, thank you, and I'm sorry I didn't introduce you properly, but I think a lot of people know you because you served on many TACs in many states, but for those who don't know Joe, he is at Arizona State University and does serve on the Smarter Balance TAC, so thanks an awful lot for that that very comprehensive review. So Joe, just the paranoid student in me needs to ask a question. And that is, maybe this is an interim assessment question for the consortium, but how are we doing? How are we tracking with regard to evidence-based design, sort of, relative to other state programs, and, sort of what's the prognosis for us in this theoretical sphere? I'll go on mute.
Okay, but I won't. I work in a number of states, as Joe mentioned. My sense, Joe, and others, is most states have not had the opportunity to plan ahead the way the work in Smarter Balance is planning ahead. And it's not the case, by the way, that Joe and Linda and Christian and Karen are sitting around with plenty of time to do things. It's simply that this level of planning is setting in place and being very serious, not just in attitude but in action, about implementing an evidence-based design approach. That has simply been a non-negotiable approach. This is how Smarter Balance will proceed. That's very different from states, many of which, if not all of which, are, in the way I see it, are basically in survival mode. The goal of the day is to get to the end of the day without sinking the ship. I don't mean that disparagingly, but with various activities and legislative initiatives, minimizing funds and so on, it's been very difficult for states to kind of stop the process for enough time to do the kind of planning required to implement this type of approach. And as I say, it's not the case that the Smarter Balance leadership had lots of leisure in this regard. It's simply, in my view, that this has been made a priority. This is the way it's going to be done. I think in states also, the extraordinary emphasis on scores has really kind of corrupted the system. How are students doing? How many are in this level or that level? And that pressure is really difficult. Now, that will come to Smarter Balance, but I think in this planning phase, there has been extremely good judgment used to bite the bullet and do the work up front. So when the business of interpreting scores comes along, that is, an interpreting assessment evidence comes along, it won't be reduced to trying to figure out what scores might mean, because the meaning will have been built into the system. So that's my best response, Joe.
Thanks. Thank you, Joe.
Joe, this is Stanley Rabinowitz. How are you?
Hi, Stanley. I'm good, thank you.
Presumably, when you go through this kind of approach, your blueprints look different, your reports might look different, your interpretive guides might look different. How much supports do states need, or are we going to need to get teachers, to get even our State Department friends comfortable with this design and able to describe the benefits of it and explain the results that come from an assessment built around this kind of approach?
I think that's a very useful question, and my intuition and experience would suggest it's not going to be as challenging as it might seem in the abstract, and let me explain. What I've seen in many states over decades is folks in English language arts trying to squeeze what they do into a prescribed format. Folks in science having to squeeze what they do into the same format. Folks in mathematics being, in a sense, restricted because everything has to look the same. My suspicion is, as I think about content expertise, English language art committees in various states, I'm thinking of, for example, Washington in writing, Nikki there. I think the expertise resides in the states that is the content expertise, and it's the content expertise that's central. In a sense, this process might take some burden off the shoulders of content folks who've been struggling with shoehorning what they know into a prescribed format. So I think the substantive expertise is out there. It's not clear that people have thought through the issues of developing the models, the cognition models, but that again is something that's being developed at the consortium level. Part of it is going to be getting people out of the attitude that one size fits all. I don't think the workload is going to be that different, but I think it's going to be a bit of a challenge to get people out of the cookie cutter mentality that we can just push the assessment of all content areas at all grade levels, at all levels of cognitive complexity or simplicity, getting people out of the frame of mind that we can just grind all of that through one model. I don't think we have to do that kind of reductionism, and I think the expertise is out there. I think variation in score reports might be part of it, but the payoff is so much more useful in terms of actually advancing student learning. And I don't think, folks in the State Departments cringe at anything new for good reason. But I don't know that this is so much a radical break in a new thing as doing some of the kinds of things folks wanted to do with a clearer focus.
Joe, this is Michael Hawk in Vermont.
Hi, Michael. How you doing?
I'm just fine. How about you?
Good, thank you.
So I'm not sure this is relevant to your presentation, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Many of us last week were at a large meeting about implementing the Common Core, and one of the authors of the Common Core, one of the chief writers, was there and was presenting things that she felt were major differences. And one of the things that struck me that she brought up was in mathematics, there's a new emphasis on fluency. And so I was thinking about your model and, you know, our need to be able to draw inferences about what's going on in kids' heads. And it seems to me that what she's saying is that one of those inferences is how fast are things going on in kids' heads. And I just, you know, I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Well, you know, what are the implications of measuring fluency, which we haven't either done or haven't done well in the past, and what should we be thinking about in your evidence design model?
Well, the first thing I think, I'm not going to say much about this in response, but I think the first thing is you better figure out what fluency is. I mean, it's an easy word to say. We can reduce it to speed of processing, but we better figure out what cognitive processes help us understand why some students move through material more quickly than others. So that's the first issue. I mean, to say we're going to look at fluency reduces what may be a very complicated cognitive process to a single phrase. So putting concept labels on things often makes us think we've actually understood them, and all we've done is put a name on it. I'm going to defer to anybody else online who at SBAC who wants to respond to that. But I guess my response, Mike, is still, Michael, to get back to the issue of what does it actually mean, and the issue of how much stress do we want to put on that? How does it fit into the system?
Okay. Well.
Thank you for the questions. Are there other questions before we move on to the other section of the presentation?
Yes.
Yes,
this is
right ahead.
Susan from Oregon.
Go right ahead.
And I want to follow up on your statement you made just a few minutes ago about, you were talking about your concerns about what's happening with scores, test scores, and you made the statement that meaning will have been built into the system. Could you elaborate on that? I really want to make sure that I understand what you mean by that.
Okay. Let me start with the non-example, and that is if you take one of those traditional table of specifications, like I had up in slide whatever, you know, you have content and across the top these taxonomic levels, and you get a score of, say, 35 out of 40. It's not immediately obvious what that means about what students know and can do. One could globally say, well, they seem to know a lot about this unit as we have defined it in this fairly restricted way. But beyond that, there's not a lot of information. What I'm thinking more about is if you have a very coherent understanding of what are the steps in the process of learning in a certain area. And while it's convenient to break things down into different cognitive processes, that isn't actually how we do it. But if you have a pretty clear understanding, description of those steps, and some of that is in the document, much of that is described in the document you'll be seeing in a few minutes, then you build the assessments to be right on top of those. So if you have an assessment and you look at the evidence, and the evidence is compelling, that whatever it is you built that assessment task to reveal, the student can really do that. The point is that the task is tailored to provide some insight into very clearly defined cognitive processes, very particularly defined ways of knowing. So again, we end up back with the basis here is if we say students have become more proficient in writing, what does it mean? Not just in terms of scores. And you know, we have all lived with performance level descriptors or whatever phrase your state might use. Those are moving in the right direction so that performance has some meaning, but we need to elaborate on those with more cognitive kinds of insight into what processes move people from being basic at something to being proficient or advanced or whatever your categories might be.
Thank you.
I mean, another way, and I would like to make this as a summary statement, Joe didn't have occasion to mention, but some of you know I've done a lot of work on the psychometric side of things, which is valuable. I don't want to I don't want to diss that. All the action is understanding what you're trying to get insight into. It has nothing to do with IRT models or equating or any of that. It has to do with how well do you understand what it is about students and their learning? How well have you understood what those processes, dynamics, interrelationship among elements how well do you understand that? That's really the core, and that's why I'm so enthusiastic about this approach. It really gets back to the one aspect of an assessment design model that really can pay off.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, and Joe, thank you for the answer.
Okay.
For our agenda here, I think we should move on so we can make sure we have plenty of time for the other pieces. Joe, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And thanks, folks, for the questions and comments. Carlos, will you take us to the next? Let's just move on to the next slide. And Linda, this is I think your first slide.
Okay. Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, good. Thanks so much, Joe, for that really helpful overview of evidence-based design. One of the things that Joe noted is that a critical question in evidence-based design is how do students represent knowledge and develop competence in a domain? And we know that the Common Core standards have tried to lay out what knowledge and skills students should acquire, and a theory, or you might even say a set of hypotheses about how they develop this competence, you know, in the kind of learning progressions they've laid out. But the Common Core standards don't by themselves tell us how these developing abilities can best be represented and assessed. If our goal is first to draw valid inferences about what students can do outside the testing situation, in particular, we're challenged to think about that in college and career-ready contexts. Second, if our goal is to reveal where they are in the process of developing these competencies. And third, if our goal is to inform and encourage instruction that supports developing competence. So to do this, we have to be very clear about what kind of inferences we want to draw. Those end up being expressed as claims, and then how do we propose to obtain the evidence to support these inferences and claims, and that will be discussed in the document that Karen is about to present as evidence for each of the claims. We've been really fortunate to be assisted in this process by Karen Hess at the National Center on Assessment, other experts that she has assembled, extensive feedback from people like Sue Pimentel, who's one of the Common Core standards writers in English language arts, as well as some of our own TAC members, including Jamal Abdi and Martha Thurlow, around issues of accessibility. And the goal of the document that you'll be reviewing and that we want extensive feedback about is to create this bridge between the standards and the assessments, and then ultimately the standards, the assessments, and instruction. It does, as Joe suggested, organize the standards around major constructs and big ideas. It really expresses carefully and with a lot of detail what students should learn and be able to do in relation to what the assessment will seek to look at to draw inferences about that. If you can go to the next slide. So these claims and evidence clarify what students should develop and how we will know what students' understanding can do. They provide a very disciplined approach to creating assessments that will allow us to both guide and evaluate what we do. And along with the description of the content to be assessed, the content specifications, there is also an additional document which provides prototypes of exemplar items and tasks that illustrate how the abilities should be assessed. And the annotations of those prototypes will ultimately be able to help us explain the key features that we think are important to good measurement of the constructs that, again, will allow us to draw these inferences about what students know and can do, where they are in some developmental continuum or trajectory of their learning. So that's the goal of this exercise. I'm going to turn this over to Karen Hess, who will walk us through the document that you will then have the opportunity to both review and help others in your circle of stakeholders provide input to, so that we can be sure that the final document, which will be released in a month or so, really does reflect the view of all of you, as well as the experts who have been reviewing it before and will continue to do so, about how we're really going to be clear and confident about the nature of the assessment.
Thanks, Linda. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Can we go to the first slide? I thought it would be helpful to start with just giving you a little background on the work as it's been progressing. And as Linda said, this is not anywhere close to the final draft. There are still a lot of remaining questions, and we know that the feedback will be really helpful. I've also embedded in this section of the PowerPoint pages that relate to the document you'll be getting, so that when you go back and back through the document, these are the references to the pages in this PowerPoint. So we began back in April with some consultation and talking with Smarter Balance leadership, Linda, reviewing what the proposal had said you wanted to do and what were the work group activities happening at that point. I also spent a little time with Sue, as Linda said, to get a little bit more background on the development of the Common Core in ELA, what some of the interpretations are that they were hoping for in that document. At that point, I began to recruit some content specialists. I tried to have a broad representation from a variety of organizations, such as the National Writing Project and the Reading Association, and people who were providing professional development in ELA and so on. Those are all listed in the second page of the document that you'll be seeing when it comes out. This content team met, and we started with, again, having some discussions with Sue. And based on those discussions, then went into the document itself, the reading of the Common Core, close reading, to really start to interpret right at the word level, why did they say it this way, those kinds of questions. We also read a lot of the literature based on how children learn to read, learn to write, learn oral language, and tried to integrate those ideas to come out with a first draft of overarching claims. We tried to state a rationale for why those were important, and we began to describe what the evidence might look like for summative assessment targets. Next slide, please. You will note when you see the draft document that we're up to version 17 at this point and counting. So it's gone through a lot of minor and some major revisions. It's been an iterative process. Linda's been wonderful, just interacting with us pretty much on an ongoing basis, and then questions sent out to different content specialists. We've had some of the work groups from Smarter Balance have had a chance to see it and weigh in. And as Joe and other TAC members reviewed it about a week and a half ago, they've gotten very involved. Jim Popham gave us a lot of good concrete feedback from his perspective. Martha Thurlow and Jamal also helped us to craft some wording related to accommodations and accessibility, and you will see that. As Joe said, we wanted to be thinking about it up front, not figure out how to make this test accessible to all students after it was developed. In that process, we've refined and clarified what I'm calling assessment targets, and there are several slides that will explain what I'm talking about. But we tried to bundle some standards that were related to each other from the Common Core. We tried to provide some continuity across grade levels so that people reading the document people working in schools and people writing assessment items could think about how the language arts skills and concepts are integrated. So you will see vocabulary items integrated across reading, writing, speaking, and listening, for example. We went back over and checked alignment to specific Common Core standards, and I'll have a slide or two to explain how we did that. We also tried to establish what we thought that cognitive rigor might be for different types of questions. And in Appendix B of the document, you'll see a rigor matrix that we've been using. So it applies Norman Webb's depth of knowledge levels, but in a slightly different way, cross-matched with ways of thinking. And that may be new to some. It may be very familiar to others whose states maybe we have been working with in the past. That, when I say we, the Center for Assessment. Once we got what I would say more clarity on what those assessments might be targeting in terms of the standards, some of these content specialists helped to annotate some sample assessment items. The Smarter Balance work groups, especially the performance assessment work group, bombarded us with all kinds of examples that they were collecting. We scoured released items from various states, and we tried to articulate in those examples what an assessment task might look like in this system. So again, these are our best guess at what sample assessment items and tasks might look like now. As there's refinement to the document, of course, some of those will change. But I know from having worked in schools, sometimes that's the thing that makes it the most clear, if you can actually see what a writing prompt might look like if you're responding to text. And that'll be something that's new for most states. So those appendices will be very valuable for people who want to even dig in a little deeper. And then we explored possible test designs and reporting categories. And we did this really for the purpose of thinking about what Joe was talking about. How could you build meaning into the system? So while there are some suggested reporting categories, that's an area that I know Smarter Balance wants people to weigh in on and really think deeply about. Next slide. There are 5 major claims for ELA and literacy. Now, for those of you who've been reading the Common Core standards, you know that they talk about English language arts and they talk about literacy in slightly different ways. Literacy is when it's, from their definition, the author's definition, is when it's applied to social studies, science, technical documents. So it's really applying language arts skills across the curriculum. So that's why in the wording throughout the document you see ELA and literacy, because what this assessment system is attempting to do is to not focus only on English language arts in an English class, but how does literacy look across other content areas. So on that C page 13 would be page 13 of the document, we've laid out what these 5 claims are. The first is about students reading closely and critically to comprehend a range of increasingly complex literary and informational texts. If we just unpack that one, you can see it's about literature and informational text. It's about increasingly complex texts over time. And it's also about that close reading and critical reading, which if you've gone to anything, any event in the last 6 months where the Common Core has been discussed, that's one of the hot topics is text complexity and a range of text. So we felt that that was an appropriate claim to say that if students were engaging in the type of curriculum we think is laid out in the Common Core, we ought to be able to say that they can read closely and critically to comprehend a range of increasingly complex literary and informational texts. And so when I get to the part where we talk about what is the sufficient evidence, you will see evidence that they're reading literary text, that they're reading informational text, and that there is analysis of those texts as well as basic comprehension. Second claim is probably not unfamiliar to many states, where students can produce effective writing for a range of purposes and audiences. And in the Common Core, there's 3 primary types of writing outlined: writing opinions and arguments, writing informational texts, and narrative writing. So those are addressed within that claim. The third is, I'm sure, new to most states, even though most states have speaking and listening standards. This is an area that there probably will be a lot of discussion about, is how do you understand, what evidence do you collect to interpret that students can employ effective speaking and listening skills for a range of purposes and audiences. So we've tried to craft what that might look like, and of course we'll want feedback on the suggested activities, learning activities, and evidence that could be collected from those assessment tasks. The fourth, again, is something that's probably been within curriculum in states, but probably not ever assessed on a large-scale assessment, and that's that idea of researching, short research projects. So this claim is students can engage appropriately in collaborative and independent inquiry. So that implies that students can work with others and on their own, independently, to investigate or research a topic, pose a question, gather and present information. So this is another new area, but it's clearly woven throughout the Common Core standards. And again, it's a combination of the reading and writing evidenced in some kind of product at the end. It may be a written or an oral or some other kind of product. The last claim is students' use of oral and written language. And that's sort of a broad stroke saying that we want students to be able to use oral language, use written language, and use it across a range of literacy tasks. So as you read through the document, you will see that there's evidence that comes out of Claim 1 when students are reading that is about written language. You'll see evidence out of Claim 2 that will relate to effective writing and use of written language. You will also see out of Claims 3 and 4 speaking and listening use of oral language. So that last claim actually draws upon evidence from across Claims 1 through 4. Christian, I do have a question. Do you want me to really just go through all these slides and then wait for questions at the end, or are there any points where you want to stop for questions? I know we're sort of tight on time.
Yeah, we were anticipating that we would take questions at the end unless there's a real point that you think we need to.
Okay, very good. So unless somebody raises their hand, I'll keep going. Next slide, please. When you open the document, you will see for each claim, as Joe was talking about, there's a rationale. We've tried to go into the literature, go into the research, and say, why is close reading an important goal for college and career readiness? Why is speaking and listening important, and so on. So for each claim, there's a short rationale, which we tried to base it on what we know about the skills that students need to be prepared for college and careers. Then the next section after that describes the sufficient evidence. And here we tried to describe the kinds of assessment items and tasks students would be asked to perform on, what would be emphasized, what kind of text might be used, and then we end with some of the suggested reporting categories, some of the possibilities for reporting categories for each claim. Next slide. I've tried to lay out in the next 2 slides just to give you an idea, and it won't be as meaningful until you actually have the document in hand or perhaps would open up the Common Core standards. But basically, Claim 1, reading closely and critically, is drawing on standards from reading literature, reading informational text, and at grade 6 to, oh, we lost a 12 on that. That's a 6 to 1, 6 to 12 it should be. The literacy standards across content areas. So those are the standards that are tapped for Claim 1. For Claim 2, you see the 3 genres of writing: narrative, informational, and opinion. You also see writing literacy. Again, this would be across content areas. You'll see standards from writing and language use, which deal with editing skills. And then you'll see some writing standards that have to do with gathering evidence from text and drawing evidence from text. at grades 4 to 11. So those would be the standards that we've tried to incorporate within Claim 2. Next slide, please. Speaking and listening, you see those standards from speaking and listening that we focused on here. Conducting research comes from a couple of different areas. It comes from writing, drawing evidence, and gathering evidence, from the literacy reading standards, which are across content areas. So the conducting research claim will expand the kind of text the students will be asked to use. And then the writing literacy, so the reading and writing literacy really address science, social studies, technical text, maybe outside of literature. And then Claim 5, as I said, is use of language, and it draws from the other claims. Next slide. So I want to spend a minute talking about assessment targets. They will appear, this information will appear on pages 14 to 16 in the document. The idea of the assessment targets came from the fact that there are so many standards in so many different areas of the Common Core document. Some are similar, there's some overlap, and it was part of a making sense of where were the skills, how do they connect. So we started by trying to describe what would be prioritized for the summative assessment and link it to the kinds of items that students would respond to. We also tried to show in the assessment targets how one or more standards, or maybe parts of standards, can sort of be bundled. That was Linda's word. She started by saying, is there a way we can bundle the standards? And so the idea is if you had standards that were very similar, you could bundle them and think about them in a similar way in terms of the kinds of assessment items you would write, rather than trying to write many different items. Look at where the commonalities are. Within that, we tried to identify that there are maybe standards or parts of standards that either relate to the same type of understanding or the comparable rigor. And I'll give you an example on the next slide. And sometimes they were just similar standards across many different strands. So in the next slide, I've tried to break out what this might look like. Oh, excuse me. I have a home phone ringing right now in the background. I'm sorry about that. It will stop after the fourth ring. The next slide is showing you 3 sample assessment targets. The first one says central ideas. So the focus of that target is identifying central ideas. And then you see a description where students are going to identify or summarize central ideas or key events in a text. This is for literary text. And it notes 2 different standards that are related to that. Somebody's having a good...
All right.
Can people... Okay, good. Can people still hear me?
Yes.
Can people hear me? Yes. Okay, good. On the right-hand side, you'll see RL, which is Reading Literary Text 2, but all you see underlined in that standard is summarizing the text. So that part of Standard 2 is what would be assessed with this particular target. The RL3 says if we had questions that ask students to describe a character, a setting, or event in a story or a drama, that would also be assessed as that assessment target too. So it gives the item writers opportunities maybe in one text to ask for a summary, in another text to ask for a description of a character or setting. That wouldn't be all of those standards, but it would be those parts of the standards. And we know that the cognitive demand for summarizing would not be the same as some of the other aspects of the standard. So now skip down to the last line where you see reasoning and evidence. The assessment target here says use supporting evidence to justify or explain inferences. Here are the inferences about character development, first or third person, theme, author's message. And again, you'll see R2 and R3. you notice what's underlined over on the right-hand side. This is where if a student's being asked to determine the theme of a story using details from the text, that would be a more demanding item. It probably would be maybe an open response item where students are pulling evidence from the text. So, and the same with RL3, what's underlined is the depth of an answer drawing on specific details. So what we've tried to do is show that sometimes a standard might appear more than once in the list of assessment targets, but it's a particular aspect of the standard that has some comparability. The one in the middle, where it says word meanings, this is about determining word meanings, multiple meanings, shades of meaning, using roots, affixes, context, and there are quite a few standards at 4th grade that do that. There's one in reading literature, and there are a couple under language use. And you'll notice over on the right-hand side again, only the parts of those standards that would be addressing that basic understanding of word meaning would be underlined. So look at RL4. It says determine the meaning of words and phrases as they are used in text. That's a typical, if you knew what the intent was, which definition of this word would be appropriate here. The second half that is not underlined says including those that allude to significant characters found in mythology. That's a figurative use of language, and that part will show up in a different assessment target. Actually, it's target 7. So again, we've tried to distinguish, if you go back to think about what Joe said, we know that some things are more easily understood by students, such as main ideas, summarizing key events, determining word meanings. And then there are other things that are more difficult and tend to develop a little bit more slowly. That is being able to understand what a theme is, what a point of view is, being able to find evidence from the text, being able to interpret figurative language. So the assessment targets are built for each grade level to try to show a way that you could think about teaching and learning and understand where students might be along some continuum of learning. I know this is a lot to talk about, so I don't know if anybody has a question before I go to the next slide. There's a couple more slides to go. If not, we'll proceed. Please. The other thing that we've tried to include with each assessment target is to show what we think the intended depth of knowledge level would be. So some of them will say depth of knowledge 1 or 2, others might say 3 or 4. We've also tried to illustrate in this document how the assessment targets relate to a hypothesized learning progression. Joe talked quite a bit. He mentioned learning progressions, and until we really test them out, they are hypotheses about how learning typically will progress. So it's the student or it's the analysis of the evidence that we use to validate our assumptions. And as he suggested and reminded us, it's the typical student we start with, but we know that all students don't learn in the same way. So we've tried to build that thinking into the document as we're building these assessment targets. Next slide, please. This slide shows you the view of what a set of assessment targets will look like when you open the document. This is only the first 4. There will be 7 for reading literary text and 7 for reading informational text. There's sort of a parallel form that follows across the grades 3 through 11. But this gives you an idea of the layout. First, you see a statement of what the claim is. So this is claim 1. Students can read closely and critically to comprehend a range of increasingly complex literary and informational texts. Then you'll see some general conditions. So based on what the text and what our conversations have been with the authors of the Common Core, we know that at grades 3 through 5, 50% of text-related assessment evidence should probably come from reading literary texts. And that may include, not limited to, but it will probably include stories, poems, plays, or legends, that type of text at 4th grade. Then you'll see the assessment target. So the first statement says, to the degree possible, all literary passages will include at least one item assessing each of the assessment targets below. So the first is that using key details. So there'll be a couple of questions for each passage which elicit some basic information. Either it's explicit or it's an inference made about the text. They will relate to standards 1 and 3, probably at a depth of knowledge 1 or 2 level. Then assessment target 2, they will be asked something related to summarizing central ideas or key events. That will be at a depth of knowledge 3. Again, the same standards possibly being addressed. So those first 2 is to get at, do they have a basic understanding of the text? The third assessment target is about word meanings. Those could be words in context for that text, but there might also be some other word meaning items that are using dictionaries or glossaries or using word attack skills. Then you'll see assessment target 4, which is probably that richer item. And you'll notice there's 3 possible standards here, standard 2 and 3, which I already talked about. Standard 6 is underlined. The reason it's underlined, and throughout the document, we've underlined any standards that require more than one text. So for example, standard 6 would ask students to provide supporting evidence after reading 2 texts and maybe comparing the themes or comparing the point of views or comparing something about characters in those texts. So those are 3 different opportunities depending on the texts that are chosen at a particular grade level. You notice there the depth of knowledge levels are possibilities for 3 and 4, and that will have something to do with the number of texts a student is required to read. But I will say that at all grade levels, there are some Common Core standards that require more than one text. They might be several short texts. It might be a poem and a longer text, which we have seen in some large-scale assessments in states. But it's something we're probably going to be seeing more of down the road with the Common Core standards. And I think just to let you know, there's 4 because 4 fit on the screen well, but there would be 3 more that as they build, you'll see that they build to other interpretations, looking at the reasoning behind it, comparing, integrating the visual information into the how it's used in the text, and interpreting figurative language. So the progression of the targets are sort of building to deeper understanding. And I'll stop there because the next slide really is just giving you some pages and some final wrap-up. And if anybody has specific questions, I'm hoping that I have enough in here so when you open the document, you'll understand what you are looking at. But are there questions about the assessment targets? Okay, I guess we'll go to the next slide. As Joe said, maybe I put people to sleep. It is afternoon, after all, in some places. So the draft that you're going to be looking at includes only grades 4, 8, and 11. We've started to develop grade 3, grade 5, grade 6, grade 7, but we're at a point where it'd be good to get feedback rather than fully develop all grade levels, but at least it gives you an idea of what learning and assessment targets look like at grades 4, 8, and 11. Within each discussion, we have a little bit of a discussion about the text complexity, especially for claims 1 and 2. We have some of our TAC members have contributed some suggested considerations for our English language learners and students with disabilities and how that relates to each claim. So each claim has some caveats which help us to think about what the assessment might look like. You notice I have still many decisions to be made on speaking and listening. There are a lot of good ways to assess speaking and listening. We know that it's probably going to involve some local administration and maybe local scoring of some aspects of that. So that's an important one for people to discuss and think about and weigh in on. There are, of course, decisions, and Joe, I think, or someone, Christian maybe is going to talk about the survey, but there'll be decisions to be made before any of this is finalized. And then I just wanted to call attention to 3 appendices that are attached in this document. One speaks a little bit about interim and formative assessment evidence. It's still in progress, but we really feel that once we're solid on what the summative evidence is, that it would be very helpful to schools and teachers to think about what are the formative, what kind of formative and interim information would be really helpful to see if students are on track. There's the cognitive rigor matrix in Appendix B, which gives you a little bit different view of Webb's depth of knowledge and the revised Bloom as they are integrated. And then Appendix C is an example of one way to look at learning progressions in reading. It's just an example. It's not been endorsed by Smarter Balanced, but it's a way to start thinking about it. A lot of reading of research about how reading develops has gone into the development of that, and you can start to see how if you had assessment items along a continuum, whether it be this one or some other one, and depending on how well students did, you get a sense of where they are on that continuum of learning. So we hope that will continue to evolve as we field test items and look at student work and refine our thinking about how learning develops. And that is the end of my slides.
Thank you, Karen. Before we move on, let's provide just one more opportunity for questions. Karen, you did just go through a lot, and
I know.
digest it all. But let's just have just an opportunity for questions for Karen at this point.
Karen, this is Kevin in Utah. You had said, and it started back on slide 30, several times made statements about this is our best guess or these are suggested interpretations. You know, you talked about possibilities for DOK 2 and 3, but you'd alluded to others. The reason I point this out is not from argumentative, but really to try to get a sense of when this document's accepted, it's going to sort of be marching orders for a lot of people. How in the document have you outlined suggestions versus salutes as far as interpreting the document?
Well, I would anticipate, Kevin, that once the states, the Smarter Balanced states have weighed in, it will become the guide for test and item development. So if it says we want items at depth of knowledge 3 addressing these standards, it will take the guesswork out of it. It will be what's expected. Right now, we're still trying to get a sense of, do people think this is a good balance of emphasis across each grade level? But I don't think it's going to leave questions in a test developer's mind when it's finalized. This will be how it's being interpreted. What I found very difficult just looking at the Common Core standards is you would have a standard that could be at multiple complexity levels. And so it wasn't until we started to tease them apart that we saw opportunities to show a range of performance. And so I think if people feel comfortable with this approach, that will clearly direct the kinds of test items and the development of a test blueprint at each grade level.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Karen. Joe, given the time remaining, I suspect it's probably a good idea to move on to the next set of slides regarding process and feedback.
Okay. I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine.
Great. Probably hear the train in the background because I'm in Seattle Public Schools building near Safeco Field. So let's go ahead and move forward, and I'll try to get this wrapped up in less than 10 minutes. So thank you, Karen, very much, and Linda also for the transition there. And I think you all can see that Karen and Linda have been working very hard to make sense out of the complexity that's embedded within the Common Core, and also transform that making sense into something that will help us build an assessment. What you'll see when you receive the document are is also a sense of what are the score reporting categories that you might be thinking about. In other words, where might we have enough depth within the assessment to my computer screen just just locked me out. Hold on just a second. I can come back so I can see the screen. That less than 10 minutes thing might not make sense now. It might not work for us. Let's see what we got going on here. Okay, come on. Well, Christian, you're going to have to take, nope, there it is. Wait a minute. Okay. So there will, of course, be a total score for ELA literacy. In addition to that, given the focus that Karen is talking about, I think it's evident that there'll be a lot of emphasis in the assessment on reading and writing, and so we'll have a reading and writing score. There may be enough detail within the assessment to have subscores in reading, and there may be enough to have subscores in writing. We don't really know yet, but so that's something we want feedback on as you review the document. And then the other three claims, the speaking and listening claim, the inquiry research claim, and the oral and written language claim, we think would each be able to support a score in that area, sort of getting back to that interpretation area that Joe Ryan was talking about. So just draw your attention to that. Also, before we go on, Christian and I had a little online conversation as we were going through the presentation, and I can well anticipate that everybody, or maybe almost everybody on the call, is anxious and maybe even a little frustrated that they don't have the document in front of them, and I can certainly appreciate that. As Karen said, we're now up to version 17.1. It was 17.0 at midnight last night and 17.1 at about 7:30 this morning. And so I think we're now at a place where, except for one graphic, I think it's good enough to push. And so Christian said that West Ed would push where we are right now with it to state leads and to all of our work group members today. Our intent is to release it full bore along with the survey results out to the public tomorrow. So you'll get a little bit of an advanced look. And so at some point today, keep your eyes on the email. Those of you who are in state departments and aren't on a work group or are not a state lead, you now know who you need to pester for the rest of the day to get your hands on a copy. So let's go ahead and move forward. Next slide. There we are. Oh, that is small print, isn't it? This is embedded in the document. It's the schedule of events. It's the kind of the rollout of events. It's what Christian and I refer to as the interleafed schedule because the events, and we don't have to get into reading them right now, but the events in dark green are events that pertain to English language arts. The events that are on my screen anyway are light green, maybe they're light blue, are events that pertain to mathematics, and the events that are in white are events that pertain to both. And so this, in the document you'll see, is this kind of interleafed schedule of events carrying us to about the middle of October, which is when we will have published the final version of the mathematics standards. So the last dark green row, which is about the fourth from the bottom, at row 17, is when we intend to finalize the ELA literacy content specifications, and that's slated for Monday, October 3rd. This current release affords everybody about 3 weeks of review, and that can be found in what row? Help me out. No, it's going to be 829, something like that. There we are. It is row number 13. And somehow the color coding got screwed up here, Christian, and what was supposed to be dark green became light green. So anyway, row 13 is when the feedback is due for this first round for English language arts, and then we'll open a second round on the 12th of September, and that will be a shorter round of only about a week, and things will have to come back to us in relatively short order. So anyway, this schedule is in the document. You can take a look at it and see how mathematics and English language arts roll out for content specifications. So next slide, please. So now, embedded in the announcement of the review is also an opportunity for folks to give us feedback. We're not only sending this internally within Smarter Balance, we're sending it out to the world. So, for example, we have contacts within NEA, we have contacts within AFT, we have contacts within the various advocacy groups for students with disabilities, for English language learners, of course for various states, our National Administrators Group, and so forth and so on. So we anticipate a lot of feedback. I want to give you a heads up on what some of that feedback looks like. So let's go to the next slide or the next graphic on this slide.
And we're moving to the survey right now.
We're moving to the survey now. Okay, I see that. Okay, good. Thank you.
Question 1.
So this will be done via a SurveyMonkey, and there will be a log-on procedure for you to use to get to the SurveyMonkey. The first question that will be asked is whether you are responding as a individual or as a group, if you've convened your state agency, or if you've convened folks within your state and you want to respond as that entire group, when you click if you're responding as an individual, you'll be redirected to the other survey. And likewise, if you're responding as an individual and you click the group, you'll be redirected. So there will be 2 surveys, one for those who are responding as individuals and one for those who are responding as a group. Next slide. We're going to take demographic information here, and so we're scrolling down to a little bit of demographic information. As it refreshes up here, you can see what the kind of group characteristics are. We want to know which best describes the kind of group that convened. Next slide. I think it goes to more demographic information, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we're just going to scroll through until we get to question 5, which is the overall.
Okay, so go ahead and scroll.
Yeah, we're scrolling. It's just a delay.
Okay. Okay, so this begins, can you scroll up just a little bit? A little bit more. Just so we can catch that question 4 is not on my screen.
The top of the screen should say question 5. Is that how it appears for you?
No, I want question 4. Please.
Say one more time. You garbled.
I want question 4, please.
Oh, you want to see question 4? Okay, we'll play you the question 4. There you go.
It's taking a little bit of time to come around.
Yeah.
But here it comes. It's coming now. There. Come on now. A little bit more. There we go. Okay. So this is the group response. It's a Likert scale. For the individuals, it's also a Likert scale. It's just not that most of the people strongly agree. It's just that you strongly agree. And so for each of the claims, what we do is, and also as an overall summary, what we do is we ask questions with regard to how do you feel about this? Question 4 and question 5 pertain to the entire document and whether it's useful. Question 6 starts questions about claim 1. Do you find the claim valuable? Do you find it concise and clear? And so forth and so on. And then, as we just saw, as we were going through the scrolling dance here, there's also an open text area where you can respond and drop a block of text into if you want to provide some more elaborate feedback. In the interest of time, Christian, why don't we push to the end of the survey?
Will do. So you'll have to suffer some scrolling.
Okay. Oh, I'm suffering now. Okay. The last question is that, and this is very important for states to hear. The last question asks you for your name, organization, your state, and your email address that you want to hear if you want to be on our listserv or on our mailing list. For states in Smarter Balance and for work groups in Smarter Balance, it's very important that you fill out question 36 because we will track and monitor question 36 and look for your names. And so we will look for state lead names and emails, and we will look for work group co-chairs' names and emails. and we will pay particular attention in the feedback to the feedback that we get from our state leads and our co-chairs. So this is not a situation where everybody gets one vote. The smarter, balanced decisions and feedback and reactions from within the consortium do carry more weight, and we will be paying particular attention to that. So if you are facilitating one of these groups, or if you're listening in within a state and you can get word to someone who will be facilitating on behalf of the state, please be sure to fill this out. And I mention that because you all are already on our mailing list, and you might think it's not necessary to fill this out. But we do, in particular, want this information from those of us who are internal to the organization. And what did I leave out, Christian?
No, you made that was the main emphasis for that last question. That concludes the kind of the overview of the survey. Just as a reminder, as Joe said, we will be sending out the content specifications review document today to work groups and state leads. However, be also on the lookout for what would be the announcement that'll contain the link to the survey, and this will occur tomorrow. So the official release will be tomorrow with links to the document itself that will be posted, and also links to the survey so that you can provide feedback and responses.
The document itself runs about 66 pages, so it's a little bit lengthy. The second set of appendices that Karen and Linda mentioned that do have the sort of prototype or example questions, and also a table of guidance for building of performance tests. It also runs maybe 40 or 45 pages, so we did separate them so they would be a little bit more manageable. But again, look for them at some point today, and the official one, which will be 17 point something, will come out tomorrow. And we're about 5 minutes over, so I want to thank everybody for being on the call. Christian, back to you. Closure.
Yeah, no, thanks, folks. And as Joe mentioned, we're over time. So please contact us directly if you have any questions on how to submit feedback or any questions about the document. Otherwise, please stay posted, keep posted for documents today and the official release tomorrow.
Thanks, Christian. Talk to you later.